If you could ban one ROI-based promise from a provider talk track, what would it be?
I'm laughing because they should ban any conversation of ROI because ROI in localization is impossible to 100%.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to LocReset. I'm your host, Matt Grotenstein. This is episode 2. In episode 1, we met with a team of localization experts and discussed AI hype and how to transform that into real outcomes. Today, we are diving into the mind of the buyer. We're speaking with real-world leaders who have had to defend their budgets while under constant pressure to move faster and drive impact in a quarter, not a year. To listen to other episodes and join the LocReset community, visit LocReset.com. And also check out our YouTube channel. Please like and comment on the content you see there. That's how we get some of the questions that we'll go over at the end for everyone, is people from the community submit things to us, and we respond in time on the podcast. So now let's meet our guests. Pablo Jareda, Manager of Localization and Accessibility at Roku. Pablo has spent the last 20 years building localization and globalization and accessibility at Blizzard, Riot Games, and now Roku. Tim Arata is a partner at Locale Solutions and a former senior manager at Apple and WhatsApp. Also a trusted advisor that I have had the pleasure to work with for the past 10 years. And rounding out the group is my friend Brian McConnell, founder of Localization Technology Partners and ex-head of localization at Notion, Lyft, and Medium. Guys, before we dive in, I'd like to hear one sentence from each of you on the following topic. If you were to start an LSP today in 2026, what would you do differently from the classic model? Let's start with Tim. Tim, what's your thoughts on that?
I would make sure we get one sentence. All right.
You can have two. You could phone a friend or have two.
Commas and semicolons. Okay.
Long sentences.
Yes. I would definitely make sure that you have a raft of solutions everywhere from the latest, greatest technology to the most traditional, old style elements. You have an entire raft of these that can fulfill the customer's requirements, and they have to be real.
Pablo, what are your thoughts?
Similar for me. I'm not good at short sentences either. I would definitely say up to date on modern tools that allow us to be flexible and build custom solutions catered to the client's needs. I think that's something very important these days. Live maintenance, super important, and support. And then lastly, not leaning so heavily on AI that you lose granularity. I see a lot of new products that come out trying to do everything, but when you dig into it, there's a lot of features missing. These days, I'm lucky to have 3 people in my team, so a partner is going to have to do everything. So I think that's something they have to keep in mind.
Got it. Perfect. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, twofold. One, I'd be careful about pigeonholing myself as a translation-only provider. Focus more on content-related solutions, including translation, and then also be technology first and able to work in a variety of platforms.
Makes sense. Pablo, over to you. In my opinion, you're the one guy in the room everyone is trying to reach. What does someone have to do to get on your calendar and in your line of sight?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I wouldn't dare tell a salesman how to sell that. That would be silly. But I can tell you what works for me personally. Open with the hottest, most relevant features, even if they're not fully released. Don't tell me about AI pipelines, automated workflows, speed, quality scores. Those are all basic features. If you don't have those, I'm not even talking to you. So everyone should have that kind of stuff. I want to know what makes you better, what makes you different, right? I've been doing this for a while, so I've seen tools, I know tools. I want to know what do you do differently that is gonna make the effort for me to switch worth.
That's fair. Let me ask you this too. Part of the reason I wanted to start LocReset is to use enterprise experience and learning and mistakes and successes to help educate the middle market who doesn't necessarily have the background and experience that some of the folks in this room have, but B, they haven't had access to the knowledge and, I guess, the experience again that you have, meaning they tend to be in an echo chamber and only get information from their vendors. The reason I'm asking this is because you made great points there, that the things we think of or the middle market might think of as features are kind of table stakes for you at this point, once you get to sort of the enterprise level. And a lot of the how are you different? How are you going to serve me differently questions? I know from experience, we don't necessarily answer in the sales process, primarily because we're focused on what we do and what our features are. We sort of get into a habit of regurgitating all of the things that are in a pitch deck and not really focusing in on what the impact and the outcomes are for a client. So that was somewhat of a tangent and not really a question, but I wanted to get that in there because it was really core to why we started LocReset. So Pablo, tell me about a KPI you designed at Roku or that was designed for you at Roku, and how it ties into localization directly.
I have to say I don't have a great answer for that because we try to set up KPIs and OKRs a couple of times in different companies, especially at the beginning when we were young and we're like we have to be compliant, everyone's doing it, it's gonna be great. And the truth is that it doesn't work great for localization. So we went back to the pragmatic approach. Very simple. You first do really good market research. You decide that do I want to be in this market or not. And two, just do the work. Estimate it, align with stakeholders, design the pipeline, and then you give it your all until you get there with whatever tools you have at your disposal. And after that, you work at the kinks until you have a fully localized product, turn it into a minimal maintenance pipeline, and rinse and repeat. And then you should trust that you hire me because I'm always going to be checking on the cost, performance of this pipeline, optimizing it later. But I haven't found personally, and if someone has, please share with me a good KPI or OKR that makes sense for a localization team to follow, unless it's that OKR or KPI of someone else above us or tangential that we can help them with.
That's fair. Makes me think of a term that I'm not sure where I first heard it, but vanity metrics, that sometimes we come up with as buyers, providers, solution providers. We come up with vanity metrics that serve us more than they serve the end user. All right. Next, say you're evaluating a new tech or service provider in the industry. What is the first signal that tells you these people really understand my world?
That's a good one because it feels like you said before, it always feels a little flat initially. I need to know that you've listened to and collected the main true pain points of running a localization pipeline, and then ask me which ones of those or which others do I experience or do I suffer from. Do a little bit minimal work on me, see who I am, what's my experience in the industry, and craft your communication a little bit for my tier of expertise. You don't have to make a customized this is for Pablo tier, but at least make a tier of communication that is this person has been doing this for a while. I don't want to tell them about how tools work, that kind of stuff. So, and then take an educated guess. Which features do I need and which are the best for me? And use that instead of as we say, instead of the basic pitch of we do AI.
Fair. All right. Appreciate that. Next few questions are for Tim and Brian. Um, when you're in get it done mode, and I'll throw this question to Tim because it makes me think of a conversation you and I had in the past. But when you're in get it done mode and you're under pressure to launch, what kinds of discovery questions from your partner, your provider, feel helpful, and what kind of just feels like they're wasting your time and asking you sort of things that matter to them but don't really matter to the project. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'll flip it around a little bit before I answer their question. I'll flip it to say it's really incumbent upon the client to state the requirements when it's pressure time. Okay. So everything has to be in conformance to those requirements to just get the damn project done. Okay. So you said about what kind of questions are good and what are bad. I'll give you a really simple answer to that. Don't ask the client open-ended questions. When it's crunch time, ask them yes or no questions. For example, we think the requirement for these languages is this, and we're working accordingly. Is this correct? So in other words, when you have questions, make sure that you state what you're doing or your understanding and then get them to a yes or no. If I'm on the other end of that, I'm really happy. Yes, that is, your understanding is absolutely correct. Go for it. Or no, what I really meant was this. And it simplifies things a great deal. Don't try to engage them in long philosophical conversations because we got to get stuff done. So ask them yes, no questions. That's the best thing you could do for your clients.
Fair point. Well, in that vein, Brian, do you agree? Yes or no?
Yeah, I think, and this is more and more of an issue. I mean, I work with a lot of startups, and, pretty much everybody is building AI-based products in some way. And the localization of the user interface and help documentation, the sign up funnel, all it falls in the domain of traditional localization. But there are a lot of other things that the LSP really doesn't have any, control over. So if the company's offering an AI-based service, that product is linguistic in of itself, and there's not a lot that an LSP can do to address that. So I think keeping the LSP focused on, the things that they can control, and their deliverables, that makes a lot of sense.
Makes sense. So, Brian, this question is for you. You and I have worked together in the past, and fortunately, I don't think you ever had to fire me. But think about the last vendor you stopped working with. What changed your mind and took you from trusting them to showing them the door?
Well, the main thing I look for from an LSP, I mean, most LSPs are essentially, staffing agencies, staffing and project management, and those are the things I really care about. If they have, you know, high quality professional translators and copy editors, that's criteria number one. And then criteria number two is that they're good at handling, they're, basically making sure things don't fall through the cracks. And the thing that'll erode my trust is if, we see a, drop off in quality after a couple months, is that's, an early indicator that, they're playing, kind of, hide and seek with their best translators and moving them on to new projects and, hoping that, we don't really notice. So that's kind of my number one pet peeve is, the, um, you know, hide and seek game with the translators. So.
Yeah, sort of the bait and switch of you get the A team to start off with, you get into a routine and a steady state, and then they move the A team on to the next project. Yep, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I mean the best agencies that I've worked with, you know, like they just were good at getting stuff done. I didn't have to really worry about that a whole lot. We just have a weekly check-in and, we kind of knew where everything was at. And that's what I want. I don't want surprises. So
Yeah.
Makes
Matt,
sense.
can I jump in? Because
Sure.
this is more an improv. So it's to what Brian said, it's a yes and. And I'm also tying this back into what Pablo said, right? About table stakes. So I agree with Brian that transactionally everything has to get done. When I had sent agencies packing is when it was just purely transactional and transactional was okay at best. So in other words, if they can only be transactional, yeah, and they get the job done, and that's okay. But if they can't be strategic or help us to optimize the program in any way, that's when I send them going, yeah, Brian, completely agree. If they cannot transactionally comply, what's the point, right? But to what Pablo said about the table stakes is being transactional, that's table stakes. So being able to add a value add and some type of consulting thought, I find is helpful. And when they can't do that, it's like, what's really the point here?
Yeah, the other thing I would add is I haven't really had to fire a vendor completely. What we would normally see is that, they would struggle with Korean, for example. And so we'd need to bring in another vendor specifically to handle that language or group of languages. And, if you have the right technology stack in place, managing, 2 or 3 vendors is about the same amount of work as managing one. And, so I don't like to fire vendors if I can avoid it, just because it's disruptive, and then you have to onboard somebody else. But I do usually expect that we'll run into a situation where it's like, okay, we're going to need to bring in a specialist for this region, and that's,
Yeah. And if you are on that verge, you can say something really subtle to the vendor, a la, this is not working. You need to improve or else something like that. I think that's perfectly acceptable. Said a little more diplomatically than that, but that's been very helpful in the past.
It helps
And
them as well. Also, I think
great,
I have a
great
point for, I know
point.
this question was not for me, but I have a very interesting point that I discovered recently, and is size mismatch. I realize that there's partners that are much larger than me, and there's partners that are much smaller than me, and neither of those work really well for me. A partner that is too large for me, I'm not relevant. I don't matter that much. If I need a feature, good luck. It's gonna go to the bottom of the pile or never get done. A partner too small cannot keep up. So for me, it's been awesome to try and find a partner that is at the same step of the ladder or the race or whatever it is that I am, because then we're helping each other out. I matter to them, they matter to me, and we can grow together. And I found that to be super helpful.
Pablo, I'm jumping up and down as you're saying that. Yeah. And I just refer to it as right sizing. You have to right size your vendors. So, oh my God, I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, 100%. Most of the companies I work with are small to mid-sized companies. So I always try to hook them up with like a mid-size LSP. If you go to We Localize or RWS or whatever, whoever it is now, unless you're Microsoft or Google, I mean, you just don't matter to them. Whereas a mid-sized company is big enough that they can, service your needs, and you're big enough that, they'll actually prioritize your accounts.
Yeah, interesting thought. For no one in particular, what does that calculus look like? How do you, as let's say, I mean, I'll put it to you this way. Pablo, you're at Roku. I don't know off the top of my head how many employees or the revenue of Roku. I would imagine it's a few $1 billion. How would you say, or what would you say is the right size vendor for you? Like, how does a vendor figure out that calculus of I'm the right size to go after X type of company or X size company?
I think, unfortunately, it's virtually impossible because the size of Roku is a lot less relevant as it is the size of my team and the volume that I produce for Roku. And I don't think anyone can estimate that looking from the outside. There's no way. You would think like the company is massive, as you say. Well, massive, it's not Microsoft, but it's big enough that you would think you want to work with the biggest players, and that has turned out not to be that true for us because our team is very tiny. Our volume output is not that large, but it is extremely strategic. So I don't think anyone from the outside can, even me from the outside, took me a while to realize who I should be working with. So that's that.
Matt, I got
Fair.
one. I got
Go
one
ahead.
for you, Matt.
Yeah,
And this is an imperfect science, but you can ask your vendors, and here's what you ask your vendors. Give me they don't have to name their top 10 accounts, but ask them if they will give you their revenue or percent of revenue, preferably revenue, in each of their top 10 accounts. And this is where it's imperfect. You don't want to be in that 30 percentile. And this is where it's a guess. I think if you're like in the 30 to 60 percentile, you're good, right? Even being up there, being the bigger fish in the smaller pond is a good thing. But ask them, and they'll hem and haw, but say, hey, look, I don't care who the companies are. Just give me the data so I can better understand this. And that
That's a
has
good point.
worked.
That's a great way to look at it, Tim. I appreciate that. Great insight. All right, moving on. For no one in particular, gentlemen, Loc, service, or tech provider walks into the room. And this is not a joke, but a Loc service or tech provider walks into the room. They've got 20 minutes to make their case. What should their first 3 slides say?
I could go. I can start. For
Right.
me, custom workflows, live support, and constant evolution. Those are the 3 things I care about. Like I said, table stakes, right? I expect every vendor to have a solid baseline of everything that I need in terms of features. Granularity gets complicated, but if you can build things that work for me, that's great. Live support is super important these days because, again, we're 3 people, we're not engineers. Your tool is super complicated. We have AI, we have RAG, we have so much stuff. I need you to tell me, how do I use these things to my best benefit, right? So you start with those 3 things, I'm in, or engage at least.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to my previous point that I'm really interested in knowing like how they source their talent, and how they, deal with project management, and then what technologies they're proficient in. Those are the 3 things that matter to me. And you'll notice the cost isn't even really in the top 3. That'll all be negotiated, but it's, the cost of localization and the overall scheme of operating internationally is pretty trivial. So I'm not interested in finding out how cheap you are. I don't want to waste money, but I'm going to assume that we'll be paying market rate for the service for sourcing.
Great point, Brian. And I'm lucky I get to go last. I had 30 seconds to think about this. So the first slide is an intro to your company, no more than 20 words. All right. And then the second slide is your partnership philosophy. This is how we partner with our clients. And then the third slide is simply what Brian was talking about mostly is, and here's what we have. And these are the table stakes items, as Pablo has brought up numerous times. These are table stakes items. So a brief intro, partnership philosophy, what we have, what we're offering.
Yeah, and I want to add, there are a couple of things I specifically don't want to hear about. One is I'm not interested in hearing about your proprietary translation portal or whatever, because most LSPs aren't that good with software. And so you're building your own tools. If you're a technology provider, that's different. But if you're an LSP and you're showing off your portal, I'm expecting that you'll work within the context of the TMS or similar platform.
Fair. Love your point on pricing. It made me smile. I don't think there's a procurement person in the world who would agree with you, but I just definitely don't think you're wrong about pricing.
I do. I'm Team Brian on that one.
Fair. All right. Little round robin. Tim, do you have a question that you want to ask Pablo?
Always dying to know this from where you sit. So you're not speaking for the industry, you're just speaking for yourself. TMS, Translation Management System, do you think they're flourishing? Are they steady state? Are they dying or are they dead? And again, this is just from your perspective, so no pressure, man.
I really love this question because I think about it a lot. When I went to Local last year, my thought was, our LSP is dying. And then someone told me, actually, our TMS is dying. And I'm like, okay, let's break this down, right? I think right now, today, a good TMS is doing great for me because they have the RAG technology, they have the capability to archive my stuff and process it and do great for me. And it works really amazing. Am I gonna be able to do that tomorrow myself with an agent? Maybe. I don't know. But I think it feels to me that there'll always be a place And my reasoning is the same reasoning I had some engineers the other day tell me we're gonna create a captioning platform internally using AI, and I'm like, maybe you're 30 years late to that conversation. Like the people that are making those businesses also have engineers and also have AI, so they're gonna be leaps ahead of us. So it seems to me that there will be a good use for TMSs as long as they continue to develop, and they will have to adapt a lot, but who knows? I don't trust my words anymore longer than a year.
It's a good point, though, about the captioning platform that you mentioned, or building some sort of internal captioning platform. With all of the things that are on the market today, I just don't understand why someone would go and build their own when they could deploy one that's already been built, and the cost is minimal compared to building it on your own.
Yeah, I just would add to that. One of the things I see a lot of tech startups is, people are often tempted to build their own tools, and I think that's just going to get worse now with all the slop coding that's going on. So somebody will think, oh, how difficult could that be? It's just a database of translations, and as we all know, there's a lot more to it than that, and nobody likes to maintain these tools. So, it's a lot cheaper to go with an external vendor, even if they're not perfect, because at least, the boring, you know, boring maintenance work is handled by the vendor. So,
And you fall off too. You create that tool. If that wasn't the entire purpose of that team, they will fall off. Technology advanced super fast, and now you did that thing and you cannot use it that much because there's a lot of tools that do much better for you.
Brian, over to you. What's on your mind today? What are you thinking about most when it comes to the industry?
well, I mean, the thing I see, pretty much everywhere now is that, people are building on top of AI services in some way or another. And that really is, resistant to, traditional localization methods because, how well the AI performs in a given language is a function of, how well it's trained in that domain or that language. So these companies, they can localize the UI, they can localize the help center and all the other user touch points. But, if the, AI service itself doesn't work in a particular language, it kind of doesn't really matter how well everything else is translated. And like one of the companies I'm talking to is an AI coding service, and an overwhelming amount of that training data is in English because most software is written and maintained and documented in English, or sort of um, basic English if it's a foreign company. So that sparsity of training data is really an issue, and maybe that'll get better. As you can translate from from Spanish to English, and then back translate, for prompting. But as we know, whenever you translate, you lose information. So it's a real challenge, and so that's one of the things. And the LSPs can't really do anything about that because they're not in the business of training AIs. So, um, for some types of customers, it's a real dilemma.
So we are gonna be in that business soon.
Well, so little non sequitur. Well, it's not really a non sequitur if it's what we're talking about, but when I think of the future of the industry and the future of the LSP, I often think of what will we be next, and what I'm seeing is a lot of I hate this term. We need a better term for it, but human in the loop, meaning um, human translators who used to translate 80% of the content, now QAing and being a governance layer for the 20 or 10% of the content that needs to be QA'd as a result of it being translated by AI. And I see three sort of buckets of work for those resources. One being checking to make sure that the AI didn't introduce any structural changes, what used to probably be called DTP. Two, actually QAing the translation itself, so doing a linguistic QA. And then 3, recording what they've done in a manner that doesn't take longer than the project should or the effort should to document that to be able to go back and train an engine. Saying that out loud, I don't know where the question was, but what does everyone think about that sort of workflow that I just laid out or that concept that I just laid out?
It makes me smile now to hear the phrase governance because it sounds so highfalutin. And most of governance is, oh, do you mean that we need linguistic review of this to make sure that X, Y, and Z are complied with? So I think that's pretty funny. Yeah, I think we're heading to a translation by AI, human in the loop. Full stop. I think it's that simple. I think that's definitely the future, and feel free to disagree.
I think this might be utopic, but I see my human linguist as your Italian Prada shoemaker, right? You're gonna give him your best materials, you're gonna give him your best work, and you're gonna let him be creative and do whatever they do best, and give him that freedom. And then obviously, like you said, there's gonna be a lot of reviewing, there's gonna be a lot of tasks that are not that exciting. But I think it's gonna be a luxury market, which is, comes with downsides because in luxury market you need less people, and that's something that they might be facing at the moment. But they will get to work on things that are super targeted, very culturally relevant, very like, something that really matters for your brand.
Hey, Brian and Pablo, if I may ask you both a question, and Matt, you can jump in too.
Sure.
I feel like now linguists are going to become more and more develop more and more specific domain expertise. In other words, I don't know if I'm right about that. Do you guys have a comment?
Yeah, I think if I were working as a linguist, I would definitely be looking to specialize because I think the combination of the language proficiency and knowledge of a particular industry or domain, that's defensible because just saying, oh, I'm a really good Italian translator. A lot of that sort of pedestrian work is drying up, because that's just being handled by AI. But if you know the pharmaceutical business really well and you can translate into Italian, you know, that's that's an area where AI is not going to be as much of a threat to you. And also people are willing to pay for that kind of work. So
Mhm.
Looks
Pablo, you
like
have
the
a
modern culture is, yeah, I was gonna say the modern culture seems to be find your niche, right? It used to be in the 90s, the net.com bubble, serve as many people as possible with as much as possible, but now that thing is done, and the things that thrive are super niche. So I think you're right.
I love, Pablo, your Italian shoemaker analogy, and I think of there's someone who does the design. There's the I don't know what the name of the movie was, but it was about Gucci. And there's someone who makes the design for the shoe, and then there's different people that put the shoe together and build the shoe and package the shoe and box the shoe and send it off and do all of the work behind it. And that's a really good analogy for the way the market is moving.
Yeah, I mean, nothing against Nike. I use a lot of Nikes, but there's a big difference with translators. I think used to be Nike shoemakers. They were just working on the same thing over and over for long periods of time. And they're going to become the Prada shoemaker, which is work on very specific things, sprinkle your creativity over it, make sure that you reshape it and remanage it and repackage it. Because I think branding is what's going to get lost. If we're all using AI, we're all pulling from the same models, we're using the same stuff. How are we different? You have to protect your brand. And I think that's what they are. That's going to be their job, I think.
That's a great point. I think that is 100% should be so one of the things we do with LocReset is we release it as a full podcast in about a month. But before and after, we sprinkle in some what I've coined Loc bites, which are 1 or 2 minute cuts of insightful things that people come up with. And I think you just hit the nail on the head, Pablo. I think that should be absolutely, for whoever's listening and editing this, that should be a Loc bite for sure. And every translator and employer of translator, ergo LSPs, needs to hear exactly what you just said.
Thanks.
All right, moving along. I'm going to skip around here, but this is a relevant comment and question based on what we were just talking about, A, on AI, and B, on the future of TMSs. So if agentic AI can ingest source content, route it, translate it, and send it to a human for QA, and then push it back into product and marketing stacks, without what unique problems does a TMS still solve that justifies its overhead and cost?
I think the main thing that a TMS gives you is it's deterministic in the way it behaves. So, I mean, the problem I have with AI is it's probabilistic, and it's easy to confuse. I actually don't like the term AI because these systems aren't really intelligent. They seem like they are, but nobody really knows like how they work internally. And with language, things are very, language is tricky. And so I'd much rather have a deterministic workflow where, we have some metric around how visible a piece of content is. And then based on that visibility level or risk level, we can decide, the TMS can decide, okay, this is a high risk, high visibility piece of content. So we're going to send that through a human intensive workflow. Whereas this other piece of content is low visibility help center content. We'll send that to AI with, minimal review, for example. So, the problem I have with, a fully AI based, governance system is that, you just don't know what it's going to do half the time. So,
And that's clutch. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's consistency.
the other problem with AI is that, it doesn't know what it doesn't know. And so, like, an example I like to use a lot is, let's say you're translating something to Japanese. What AI is very good at doing is producing plausible looking Japanese content, but it doesn't, say, hey, I can't really translate that because there isn't really a translation for this into Japanese. So, whereas a human translator will just look at it and be like, nope, you need to come up with better source content that we can work with. So,
Or they'll reshape it for you, right? If you give them that freedom.
yeah.
Got it. So another question I had was, how has AI changed your expectations and the concrete behaviors and outcomes you expect as a baseline? I think we've answered that. Asked and answered. So let's move to, before we wrap up, let's move to some questions that the LocReset community has thrown into the comments section on LinkedIn group, which is, first question is for Tim and Pablo. If you could ban one ROI based promise from a provider talk track, what would it be?
I'm laughing because they should ban any conversation of ROI because ROI in localization is impossible to 100% reflect, right? So ban the term ROI. Why are you even going there if you can't be specific about it? We do know, according to one famous research agency, what is it? 75% users are 75% more likely to buy something if it's in their language and the support's in their language. That's great. So there's an ROI in localization, but come on, it's a fool's errand trying to get specific ROI in localization. So don't even bother. I know I'm ranting, Matt. Thank you for cutting me.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm one of my sayings in management is 73% of statistics are made up right on the spot 94% of the time. So you're absolutely right. And it also makes me think, your comment also makes me think of a conversation we had a week or two ago when you and Brian kind of agreed, and I think Pablo was there too, and the feedback was stay in your lane. As a provider, ROI is not your lane. So why are you even driving in it? Why are you even don't even get in the car?
Yeah, no,
All
the
right.
point I would make is that, the ROI is really, the LSP doesn't have any control over it. I mean, that's that's on me as a program manager, and it's on the senior management at the company. Because if they don't, support, if they don't invest in marketing and sales and in region activities, they're not going to see great results, even if the product is translated impeccably. I mean, there are a few exceptions where you can get organic traction. Like SaaS products that are consumer focused, being an example. But any kind of business to business application, there's a lot of other things the company needs to do correctly in order to see any kind of ROI from localization. So,
All right, my note here says to Brian and Tim, but why limit it? So open to the group. I say that, but then the question is, as buyers and buyer side advisors, what are the three things you would tell a new client, Brian or Tim, or even you, Pablo, that they should look for in a new partner? So you're advising. Let me rephrase that. You're advising a new client who's a buyer of localization translation software or services. What's the first three things you tell them they should look for and do in their journey to find a provider?
well, I usually talk to startups and kind of emerging companies that are just getting started with localization. So I actually, put the decision about which, service providers to pick, that's something to worry about later. It's more important for them to get their technology stack in place, having a CMS that can handle multiple languages, figuring out which TMS is a good fit, has the integrations with the systems that they're using or planning to use. And then after that's in place, start to look at, well, which languages make the most sense to target, and then, what industry are you in? And, that kind of drives the discussion around LSPs and captioning providers and whatnot.
Fair.
It's fun to answer this question because I get to tie in what everyone's talked about before. The bottom line is the vendor, you're looking for the best fit, right? And that includes right sizing, right? Their ability to partner, and their experience in partnership with what you specifically need, etc. The other thing is, I've got to throw this in, everybody, is RFPs, especially with inexperienced people. First of all, your RFP is too long. I guarantee you, your RFP is too long. You're trying to find best fit. If you make it long, you can't find the best fit. The second thing is, stop asking your vendors yes, no questions. Do you have experience with French, Italian, German, and Spanish? It's like, no, don't ask. They could say yes. Hey, great. You didn't learn anything. So what you need, ask open-ended questions, right? Tell us about your experience and your whatever with French, Italian, German, and Spanish. Give the vendor a chance to show how smart they are, right?
Great point. Makes me think of your RFP comment, makes me think of a conversation I had with someone at CSA Advisory. And we were talking about their maturity evaluation, how they evaluate clients on a maturity scale. And I was mentioning that one of the things I was working on is a client audit. So something I can send a potential customer, which is a Q&A that could audit where they sit and what they need and how best I could help them. And my audit was 200 questions. And CSA, I know it's probably about 4 hours worth of work at the least. And who's going to sit for 4 hours and do it? You'll be lucky to get 40 minutes or 4 minutes of someone's time to answer questions. So one of the things this person from CSA mentioned, they were one of the folks who had designed the maturity scale Q&A, is they started with 300 questions, and they boiled it down to 8. And those 8 questions got them a better understanding and output and deliverable than the 300.
Amen.
Yeah. And then I asked what were the 8 questions, and she wouldn't tell me. But I'm still working on, and maybe we could work on this together, downsizing and right-sizing, to use a term that we've used throughout this conversation, right-sizing that audit so that it's digestible and someone can actually answer it, as opposed to just hate me for sending it to them and never complete it, never talk to me again. All right. A few more questions and then we'll wrap up. So let's see. This is a good one, Tim. Makes me think of you. What is the proof point for a pilot to get the actual project greenlit? So you're doing a pilot with a client, or to better frame it for you, what you're doing currently, you're working with a buyer side client, and they're have done or doing a pilot with a service provider or a technology provider. What do you want to see during that pilot that gets you comfortable enough to say, okay, let's move forward with the actual project?
Well, to state the obvious, right? Everything has to work in the end.
Yeah.
But I tell you, what I'm really fond of is, there's a problem. How did they handle the problem? Were they open? Did they make excuses? Were they saying, hey, look, we're kind of stuck here. Let's talk about this, you know? So the more open they are, and you only really find out how a vendor, or any person for that matter, what happens when things go wrong. Then you find out who vendors really are. And so this is a great test case right there.
Yeah. We agree. I want to see how you handle my exceptions. Right. Which is what you're saying. If we have started a pilot,
much more succinctly than I did. Thank you.
yeah, if we're already doing a pilot, it's because I looked at all your features. I probably chose you among however many other partners. I know that you can do what I need. But how are your people handling an exception? And also, what kind of leverage do I have, to go back to the right sizing thing, which seems to be the theme of today? What kind of answer do you have when there is something that comes up suddenly that you did not have, I did not think of, and it's a feature that you're going to have to put in your pipeline for me to develop, for me to use? And what kind of leverage do I have on that conversation?
I think you guys, you both made a really good point, and it brings me back to something we talked about earlier in another conversation, which is, you just want to know they're going to walk through a wall for you. Not every time, not all the time, but when push comes to shove, they're going to walk through a wall for you. And I think, Tim, that was your phrase. And Pablo, I think you said it best, and I never thought of it this way. That once you get to the point of a pilot, you've already done the due diligence. You've already made your decision. It's kind of the provider or partner's opportunity to lose at that point. They can only they win by default, so to speak, but they lose by how they react to working with you in the issues. So good point.
I guess I would add, I'm always a little skeptical of pilots, just because it's easy to, front load resources onto a pilot. And then I'm more interested in how they perform over 3 to 6 months. And, like I said, I usually have 2 or 3 vendors. So, and they, the vendors all know that there are multiple vendors in the mix. So that basically, it's a form of soft pressure on them to continue performing. Because it becomes very easy then for me to adjust the dial on where the work is being set to.
Yep. That's a great point, and I hope the LSPs out there are listening to that point. And by the way, we never front load stuff, Brian. I've never seen that. I've never heard of that before. It's brand new concept to me. I've never seen an LSP do that.
Let me talk to the manager and get back to you.
Yeah, exactly. All right, last question, and then we'll wrap up, guys. We're about 10 minutes away from an hour. This one's really interesting to me, and I hope everyone listens to this entire session episode and gets to this specific question. It's certainly not the most important question, but it's one that's interesting to me. I think we've talked about a lot of really interesting things today. For the group, when buyers ghost you, what does it mean, and what should we do to get back on the radar? This happens all the time. In all walks of life, people just tend to ghost you. They don't necessarily tell you or have the hard conversation with you and tell you what's really going on. Maybe they're busy, maybe has nothing to do with you. But when you ghost someone, what's the best way to get back in your line of sight?
Well,
Okay, Brian, go ahead.
I would say in a lot of cases that it's not that we've ghosted you. It's just that, you contacted us at, the wrong time. Because typically a lot of these conversations come up whenever, you're evaluating, your vendors and your budget for the next year. So you want to be in front of them, when they're making those decisions. If we're in May and, we make most of those decisions in November, we're probably not going to get back to you unless there's some sort of crisis that we need to deal with and we bring in a new vendor. And then I think, for best practices, localization is a small world. And I think, Pablo, you've mentioned this as well. It's good form to get back to people, just let them know, hey, thanks for offering, your proposal and everything, but, we went with another vendor because blah, blah, blah. You don't need to, be a hard ass about it, but, just as a professional courtesy, just, let people know that, we didn't need your services for this particular use case. The only exception I make to that is I would get a lot of cold emails from companies that were riddled with grammatical errors and misspellings. And so I would usually reply to those with a similar number of grammatical errors and misspellings and, and suggest that they maybe invest in, AI spell checking and grammar checking, if they're going to
Terrible
sell.
form.
I can only add one thing to this whole conversation. If you're ghosted, I don't know how you get back on the radar. But one thing that actually worked with a client is how to not become ghosted. And that is to have live communication as soon as possible. A 5-minute phone call, a 5-minute video, whatever. If you've actually spoken with the person or met with the person online, virtually or in person, it's far less likely, that you're going to get ghosted. And that's a big deal for people. People use, they filled out our web form. We emailed back and forth. Qualify them, at least prevent yourself from being ghosted by talking to them in real time.
Yeah, I think it's a little strange for me when I hear it. I have a life mantra, which is I apply to everything, and it's just treat everyone as a gentleman. Not because they are, but because I am. I'm also currently shopping for a more gender fluid version of this mantra, so I can share it with everyone else. But the gist of it is, if I establish a relationship with you, if I answer to you already in some form, I will take the time, 5 minutes, write you an email to say, look, this is not going to work at the moment, and this is why. Feel free to come back to me whenever you want, and we can talk about it. But just be a gentleman. And if you don't want to be a gentleman, do it because it's good business. It's good business. This is a very small industry, and you're gonna encounter each other sooner or later in different companies, same company, different scenario. Why not have a good relationship with everybody if you can, so you can help each other out? It's pretty simple. But that's more philosophical. As far as getting back on the radar, first of all, if give me some time to breathe, right? Don't be insisting or annoying. That has never helped anybody. And second, in my case personally, I don't know if this is just me, but just send me a deck. Send me a deck with the features that you are developing. What are you bringing to the table that is new? How are you catching up? I want to know that you are evolving, that you are looking into the new stuff. Because today, every time I wake up, it's 5 new technologies, 10 new companies that I have to catch up with. So what are you doing to compete with these people? And why should I be talking to you? Also, I don't think we talked about this today, but something that is very important in this conversation of buyers and how to catch them or how to stay with them is understanding the effort that it takes for a large buyer, especially, to switch from a TMS or an LSP to another. It's titanic. You need engineering. You need to replug your CMSs to everything else. You need to understand what API calls exist in the new tool that now I have to change on my code. It's really large. You cannot expect to show up and send a cold email going like, I do fast AI translations, and someone to be like, yay, let's do this. Like, it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah, I would say, one tip I would have for LSPs is to keep tabs on, when there's a change of leadership in the localization team, that's often when, companies will look at, let's look at our vendors, both technology and service providers. And, it's one of the unfortunate things is every localization program manager kind of has their favorite vendors that they like to work with. So quite often, a new LPM they'll bring in their preferred LSP, or they'll force a TMS migration, whether that's a good idea or not. And just from an opportunity standpoint, that's a good signal that they're going to be open to new vendor presentations. I
Yeah,
think
that's true. It's very
you
true.
know, I mean, like, my attitude has always been, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. And
Mhm.
even if it's not a completely optimal, arrangement, like, if we're using one TMS for product localization and a different TMS for like long form content, that's not the end of the world. I've been in that situation before, and the switching cost it was such a pain in the ass, and there was expense involved, that we'd just be like, you know what, these systems are working well enough that like eventually we'll get around to consolidating everything, but we've only got like 2 people, so let's like focus on just
Mhm.
getting things running.
Great points, guys. A couple of comments, and then we'll wrap up. One thing that last bit of insight made me think of is at Smartling, one of the things I always wanted to build and sort of professed was a migration playbook. And I think as maybe we could talk about this in a future session, but as a service provider and a technology provider, I don't know how helpful this would be because I'm not on the other end of the table. But it sounds like building some sort of migration playbook that could be helpful to the buyer if they're changing LSPs or if they're changing TMSs would be an interesting concept. I don't know how one technology provider would build a migration playbook from another provider. They would probably have to have a lot of insight into that provider's tools and APIs and endpoints and things like that. But just thinking out loud. Also,
Wait, that's
Pablo,
let me touch on that a little bit. I think that's a
sure.
very interesting point. If an LSP can provide actual engineering support. I've I've found engineers for for very short projects that I needed. I didn't have the engineering power internally, and now we found an external engineer that could be onboarded somewhat quickly and touch a bunch of things and fix them. So if an LSP can provide that, I think that's not nothing. I think that's actually a solid idea.
Yeah, the sentence of the solutions engineer, right?
Yeah.
On the vendor side. Yeah, and Brian, I know well, it's what you do, or part of what you do.
Yeah, and the thing I mean, I would say outside of the largest companies, I mean, the localization team is usually like 1 or 2 people max, often with limited engineering support. Like when I was at Notion, which was one of the more successful companies with localization, we didn't have any engineers attached to our team for the whole time I was there. Like after I left, it moved over to growth engineering. I think they have 1 person now. So even then, that person is pretty much tapped out. So any kind of migration, if the vendor can help you with that and ideally do most of that for you and guarantees, I mean, like one of the things with CMS migrations is it's really easy for the translation memory to get corrupted, and so if the vendor will commit to making sure that gets fixed, um, then great. Then that's one less thing I have to worry about. And, like an engineer that doesn't really know a whole lot about localization, doesn't have to get up to speed on both platforms. That's, you know, to the extent that the service provider can offload work and, so you have less to worry about, I think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, most LSPs don't have a lot of technical depth. Um, So yeah, they might have somebody that's proficient in .NET or what, a platform like that, but good luck going to LSPs to find like people who are proficient in React and other modern web environments. So
I mean, they might have to start though, because also what you said about Notion, it's unthinkable to me right now. I would not be able to run anything without localization engineers. It's just impossible these days, and it's gonna get even harder.
I think they've got one localization engineer. I mean, it's one of the reasons I left was I got, we rolled up to marketing. It was a totally frustrating place to be because, marketing, they wanted sales material and everything translated, but, we couldn't get like bugs fixed in the product. They just sat there in a Jira queue or, the equivalent of Jira and, just never got fixed. And, so after a couple of years, it's like, well, time to move on.
I love this. We should do an entire episode on what we just talked about. I mean, I dealt with this all the time at Aclaro. I had two great solution engineers who are now at very senior positions in the industry. Mike Harris is one who everyone probably knows. He's at Slack and now part of Salesforce. And I think he's the last man standing in their localization engineering group, even at a company like Salesforce, that's a behemoth. And then Bill Lafferty, who's now at Toast, and they were doing this type of work. I mean, they weren't rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard engineering stuff at our clients at Aclaro, but they were certainly helping with sort of the last mile migrations and integrations. But this is a great point. Every LSP who's listening to this episode really needs to hear what was just said, and how they could be a true partner and add value to end clients. I'm certainly going to think about how we could implement some of those things in what we profess and what we do. All right, wrapping it up. Today we heard about right sizing your relationship and how that leads to buyer provider fit. We talked about how strong relationships with clear expectations turn providers into partners. We focused on what we need to do to stay in our own lane and win over hearts and minds. In summary, we heard real ideas, real objections, and real answers. That is what LocReset was built to surface. Join the LocReset LinkedIn group to share your ideas, get feedback, and see examples from peers who have successfully built world-class programs. Stay tuned for Loc Bites, short, high-impact video clips pulled straight from our episode and spotlight powerful ideas about resetting localization. And check out our YouTube page and comment and like what you see there. Huge thanks to Tim, Pablo, and Brian, and to all of you for spending your time with us and helping to reset and rethink localization.